Oh, we're recording.
Great. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Let me fix my view. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Crip Conversations, the last one of the year. And we are going to be talking with Rob Colgate, who is graduating with his MFA. And I'm very excited. And I'm going to read from the flyer his bio and then tell you how awesome he is as a person. In this conversation, MFA candidate who's graduating this week in poetry, Rob Colgate will present selections from his graduate thesis, a collection of poems titled Desire Disorder, Exploring Disability, Queerness, and the Body. The conversation will integrate his experiences working as a volunteer for Imagine Art, a studio for disabled artists in Austin. And so I am very excited that Rob is going to be presenting. I've had the pleasure of reading his poetry and his work when he's been in my courses, and it's just amazingly beautiful. And Rob himself is just a beautiful human being, and I'm so happy about him graduating and moving on into the journey that he is headed to, which he'll tell us a little bit more about in a minute. So I am going to turn it over to Rob. We do have a space for Q&A, so you can put your questions in there. We might have time at the end. So feel free to do that as Rob is talking. I am going to take myself off the screen so we can all focus on the presenter. And there is closed captioning, so please feel free to turn it on at the bottom of your screen. It is CART, if that is helpful. It is for me, and I am going to turn it over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that very generous introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob. I use he, him pronouns. I am going to be presenting on desire disorder, my creative writing thesis, and talking about how it integrates with the work I did in the critical disability studies program. So we're talking about language, disability, and making meaning. I want to start off right off the bat with a poem. I think it's important to get music and lyric in the air to sort of set our minds in the right place to understand and really take in what poetry can do for disability studies. So this is the second poem in my manuscript, Mad Napantla. As in, you are split in two hemispheres that you must hold together. As in, if you swallow fire, you can stay warm, or if you don't, you can keep living like this, and you don't want to do either. As in, you get paid to lie down on a dotted line and let it run you through the center, and you pretend that you are fully on either side and that the thin strings cleaving through your brain don't hurt. And then you remember that you didn't want money, that you just wanted to lie down, like Joan wishing God would be quiet just for once, but it doesn't matter. You put down your nerves and let the soft matter fall. Okay, now that we've set our scene, a little overview I'll be talking about in the next hopefully 20-ish minutes, maybe a little over. We'll start by talking about disability studies and the sometimes confusing concept of epistemology. We'll break that down. Then we'll move into some discussion on poetry, its different relevances, the ways it can create knowledge, the ways it interacts with disability studies. Then we'll talk about some of my time volunteering at Imagine Art and the Crip practice of art making. And then finally, we'll synthesize a lot of that together to get some final takeaway points from my experience in this MFA and in this CDS program. This will probably be a little more casual, a little more conversational. I don't want to lean too far into the academic or into the theoretical. I want this to feel accessible. I want this to feel comfortable, like a exciting learning experience rather than something we have to slog through together. So I'll just be riffing a bit, and I hope that's okay with you all. So epistemology, centering lived experience in disability studies. So epistemology refers to theories of knowledge, right? So epistemology is the cripping of epistemology, the making of epistemology of knowledge theory into something disabled, and that talks about disabled lives, right? Theories of knowledge surrounding disability must come from the lived experiences of disabled individuals and communities. So that concept was coined by scholars Lisa Johnson and Robert McCrory in 2014. And they said basically that our understandings of disability have to come from the diverse lived experience of disabled folks, as in our systems of beliefs and values surrounding disability should be actively created by and for disabled folks rather than ableist institutions that use theory to try to exclude disabled voices, right? The only truth about disabled lived experiences comes directly from disabled individuals, not from our hypotheses of what disabled individuals look and seem like, right? So in turn, we must believe disabled individuals when they talk. Too often, disabled folks are dismissed, being told they're being dramatic, asking for too much, going too slow, that their experiences can't actually be the way that we're describing them to be. So much of our theory of knowledge in disability studies has to come from believing what disabled people are telling us with their bodies and minds. Right. Another perspective is the disability justice framework. Disability justice is a framework developed out of the disability rights movement by Black, brown, queer, trans people of color. And it addresses ableism as it intertwines with other systems of oppression. So you can see glimpses of epistemology in some of these principles. Leadership of the most impacted means that the disability justice movement should be led by those who know the most about systems of oppression and liberation from personal experience. So you can see that personal experience really plays a major role in disability justice and studies and theory. Of course, there are some caveats to this, just as you wouldn't want a homophobic queer person spearheading queer LGBTQ movements, disabled folks also need to keep in mind the whole disabled community. Just because you're disabled and have a disabled lived experience doesn't necessarily mean that everything you think is going to be perfect and great for the community. But by and large, lived experience of disabled folks is how we want to go forth understanding disability. The bottom line is to listen to disabled people. When we put language to our experiences as disabled people, that's where the knowledge really comes from. So one of the ways that disabled people talk to us that give us something to listen to is through art making. So I want to talk about one genre of art in particular, which is poetry. So I'm a poet. I'm graduating on Friday with my MFA in poetry. And we'll talk about the necessity of poetry. This phrase has become pretty trendy, but originates from Audre Lorde, who is a queer, disabled woman of color. She talks about the necessity of poetry. She says that poetry is not a luxury, but rather a revelatory distillation of experience, a vital necessity of our existence, the way we give name to the nameless so it can be thought. So what she is saying is that when we write poetry, we're not just using ideas we already have to construct a body of text, but rather through the act of writing poetry, we're creating brand new knowledge and transforming our understandings of ourselves. This is what keeps me coming back to poetry over and over again, and what makes me put poetry at the center of my life. It is we give name to the nameless so it can be thought. There are things that we couldn't have thought otherwise until we wrote poetry about them. Out of literally nothing, out of individual letters and words, we create knowledge and we create feeling, right? Audre Lorde also talks about the necessity of the personal. She says, I learned if I didn't define myself for myself, I'd be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Sorry, just checking the chat real quick. So when she is saying this, she says we must write about ourselves in order to understand ourselves, to be in charge of who we are and define what we mean to the world. Now, this might feel selfish or egotistical or pretentious in some ways, but it's not at all. It's actually quite vital, especially as disabled folks. If we don't speak for ourselves, if we don't make art about ourselves and our experiences, no one is going to do it for us. So both disability studies and poetry insist on this inclusion of the personal as an urgent gesture towards survival. Just like epistemology is how our theories of knowledge should be based in lived experience, Audre Lorde shows us that our poetry should be based in personal lived experience too. So there's an intertwining here of disability theory and poetry theory, right? Audre Lorde writes a poem, Litany for Survival, and I'm going to read the last chunk of it just to think about that urgent gesture towards survival of including the personal. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. That last stanza is at the heart of epistemology and the reasons we write poetry. It is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So we talk about inclusion of the personal. So I want to take a quick moment to just talk about myself and my experiences with disability and poetry, right? I have to practice what I preach. I have to talk about the personal. So I am a queer, brown, disabled poet. I identify as bakla, which is a Filipino gender. And I have a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, essentially a mild form of schizophrenia. So that's my personal experience with disability. The disability study shorthand for schizoaffective disorder bipolar type is MAD, which has been reclaimed much in the same way that Crip has been reclaimed. So that's my disability identity. I'm also a poet, been reading and writing poetry since I was a child. But it was never something I thought I would foreground in my life. It feels sort of scary to decide you're going to put art at the very center of your life, just in terms of logistic. I originally studied psychology and neuroscience in college. I was hoping to be a clinical psychologist. My tilt was always wanting to be there to help the mentally ill and disabled. And what eventually convinced me that it was okay to become a poet was realizing that I could do that exact same work to support and guide the mentally disabled through writing poetry that embodies the personal and that embodies epistemology, through using that power of poetry to create new knowledge about the ways we live as disabled individuals, through sharing my experience in poetry in hopes that it would guide other disabled folks and non-disabled folks who are seeking to learn more about being allies in anti-ableism. It's a little bit about me. I want to revisit Mad Nepantla now that I've talked about the personal a little bit. So Nepantla is a term used by disabled writer and theorist Gloria Anzaldúa to describe an in-betweenness, being trapped between two sides, able to cross the border, but not able to be fully on one side or the other. So this poem I wrote was born out of my frustration of wanting to both fully embrace my madness, but also be fully rid of it. I didn't like it. It wasn't comfortable. And this sort of brought up the question for me, how do I learn not only to be accepting of my disability, but to be happy about it and to embrace it as part of myself? In short, how do we learn to desire disorder? So keeping that question in mind, I want to talk about my time at Imagine now and the Crip practice of art making. So Imagine Art, the mission is to empower artists with disabilities to become creative catalysts for changing systems of rehabilitation. It's a studio out in East Austin on Cesar Chavez. It's a multimedia studio. There's paint, there's sculpture, there's watercolor, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Tons of volunteers and artists constantly coming in and out of the space. Really a vibrant sort of community setting. On their website, they talk a little bit, I won't read the whole quote, but they talk a little bit about how a lot of day habilitation programs for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities are excluded from community spaces and are largely spaces just for disabled people. There are no day hab programs that integrate both disabled and able-bodied artists, and that's what Imagine Art is seeking to do with their program. So my role as a volunteer was to assist, supervise, and communicate. I worked with one artist in particular. Here I'll call him Kevin. Kevin is partially blind, fully deaf and autistic. So I would basically just sit with him every Tuesday, 9 to noon. I would get materials for him. I'd tell him when lunch was, and then I would just talk with him and communicate. We would joke around and make art together. So there were a couple layers to working with Kevin. First, on a basic interaction level, in addition to physically assisting him through the day, I would learn basic ASL. And learning ASL, even just a few sort of rudimentary signs to communicate with Kevin, really helped me think about how language becomes embodied. In the same way that a poem embodies a personal experience, ASL to me felt like a poem, as it was a literal embodiment of language, putting something physical to language, just like writing a poem to an experience, excuse me. In terms of language, it was really interesting. The way we communicated most was actually just the ASL sign for love. We didn't have long conversations in ASL. We would just flash love back and forth to each other from across the table. And that really made me think about how much we need in our communication. How much are our standards of communication steeped in something that's a bit presumptive and ableist, right? It made me think that we were forgetting something about being human beings who have innate powers to connect with each other beyond the artifice of spoken language, right? So then there was art making. Kevin would make cars. He was a car sculptor, and he was just thrilled. He was cheering, wooing the whole way through. He's cutting clay. He's shaping the body of the car. Sometimes he'd build buses. And at every point, he's cheering, he's clapping, he's pointing at his sculpture, just having the best time I've ever seen someone sculpting. And I'd just be sitting on the other end of the table working on my poetry, writing just MFA things. But we developed this incredibly natural sense of ease and community between each other, right? We were two disabled artists working on craft next to each other in community. There was also a huge sense of humor throughout the whole experience. Kevin was always laughing. We developed sort of this system of joking around that just involved hitting the table, but we were able to tell like incredibly complex and hilarious jokes to each other just by the ways how hard we'd hit the table, how many times in a row we would, when we would pretend to hit it, but not actually, right? Just this became like a highlight of my week because I was just laughing and laughing at the ways we would communicate with each other. We found a way to embody humor that was really Crip, right? So it brought to my mind how much is innate to humans that doesn't need certain structures based in able-bodiedness to participate, right? Laren is a hilarious guy. He would bump into the wall and apologize to the wall. He would joke around with me hitting on the table. And it reminded me of how much artifice of able-bodiedness is really unnecessary, right? So there is a caveat to this as well. I was supposed to be the volunteer in charge of Kevin in this day program, but I was also just a disabled artist. So the fact that there was sort of an imbalance there did trip me up a little bit, right? What puts one disabled artist in charge of the other? Imagine art is moving away from this direction where they're talking about closing the gap between disabled and non-disabled artists in a space. But it is just something I wanted to bring up to keep in mind, because it did feel weird at times that I was supposed to be in charge of Kevin when we were just two artists working in community. So I just wanted to mention that, but by and large, Imagine Art is moving in a really exciting direction. Okay, so I just want to synthesize a couple take-home points for everything I've talked about, and then we should be good to go. We can do some question and answer. So everything I've talked about, epistemology, poetry, and art making, what does it all mean when viewed in context with each other? So first, our understandings of epistemology and poetry extend into our understandings of language and art in general, right? Communicating with Kevin and ASL, flashing the love sign to each other, hitting the table, became itself to me a sort of poem. It created new knowledge and experience out of where there was nothing beforehand. Knowledge about how to live a desirable disabled life. We were having a wonderful time there, very happy, and it wasn't possible without either of our disabilities, right? And so art making extends from epistemology as a way to create knowledge, right? And not just create a sense of purpose. There's sort of this mistaken idea that disabled folks need to find their sense of purpose in their life in their disability. But it extends sort of beyond that to this capacity to create meaning where there was nothing once, right? Disabled lives are full of purpose and full of meaning without having to do extensive disability studies, right? We can simply be making art, and that gives us huge amounts of meaningful purpose. And it happens at every level of creativity. Kevin was making knowledge out of creating these cars. I was making knowledge out of writing poems right next to him. Both language and art create physical realities, making space for disability. Too often, disability is crowded out of spaces, right? It's deemed unnecessary or easy to sideline, right? But when Kevin would sculpt his cars, he would create art that proved he exists in his disabled entirety. The disability scholar Mia Mingus talks about leaving evidence. She says, we must leave evidence, evidence that we were here, that we existed, that we survived and loved and ached, evidence of the wholeness we never felt and the immense fullness we gave to each other, right? So when I write poems, when Kevin creates these cars, we are leaving evidence of the joy of our disabled lives, right? That is a huge thing. That's a huge gesture of epistemology and of the power of the personal, of the power of art making and poetry and sculpture. Disability also creates an impetus for innovative forms of communication, right? I like to think about alternative grammars, right? There's a Crip grammar, there's something grammatical to hitting the table to communicate with another disabled person, right? To just show love back and forth, and for that to become a whole language in and of itself, right? Being disabled is actually what pushed me to keep writing poetry, right? Being disabled created the impetus to write poems, to then recreate knowledge about disability. Right, so this leads me to really my biggest point is that there is something or are some things unique and desirable about disability itself. The bond that Kevin and I shared would have been impossible without our disabilities, right? None of his art would be the same if you weren't disabled, and none of my poems would be the same were I not disabled, right? The special quality that makes art valuable and beautiful and communal comes from being disabled, right? The art would not have the same beauty without the disability at hand. So there is something unique and desirable within disability, right? Art, language, and community can help us desire our disorders. I didn't want to be disabled before I started writing poems about it, but the process of writing poetry helped me desire my own disorder, right? And seeing joyful disabled folks like Kevin helped. Being in artistic community with Kevin made me want to embrace my own disability more, watching him create art with his disabilities, right? Disability spaces should also be based in mutual understanding. The best moments I had at Imagine Art were when I was just one disabled artist working in tandem with another one, when I forgot that it was day hab and when it was just Crip art making. One question folks might be asking is this enough? Is writing poems and sculpting cards enough to make us okay with disability? Should there be more to a life than this? You know, should Kevin's life extend further past making car after car after car? And to this, I want to answer with another poem from my manuscript titled Disability. A small life, a small knife demarcating the life meaning itself being a sort of acceptance, a sort of life that requires agency. Agents of good faith, agents of anesthesia, the inability to know if this is okay, but we're doing it. Okay? Okay. A small circle suggesting perpetuity, a small chance of trauma, the essentials rewiring when given the chance, a preference for preferences, a goal of wholeness or partiality, the life being partial to life in spite of holes, breakage, baggage, strain, the pain of tracking one's own eyes, the eye strain and eyeing of systems of blame, the talking cure, the deeming ready or not ready, the reading of labels, of ables, of intervening only in veins, of sleeping only in pain, accepting some good days. Right? I share this poem to underscore the point that the size of a life does not determine its quality or joy. That's my second big takeaway from my experience in the MFA, my experience in the Disability Studies program and working with Kevin at Imagine Art, is a life may be shrunken small by disability. A life may come to only exist in little bits of art, but that does not determine the quality or joy of that experience. Kevin is one of the happiest people I have ever met, right? And he has a very small life. So understanding this can create a lot of empathy, do a lot of important anti-ableist work. So that's about my presentation. Next up in my life, I'm going to be moving to Toronto on a Fulbright scholarship to study disability studies and poetry. There's a thriving disability community in Toronto. I'm going to be working with a disability arts organization, writing poems about the experiences of all the disabled people who I come in contact with in Toronto. So that's what I have. I'm open to questions now. Other than that, thank you all so much for listening. I hope this was comprehensible. I hope it was enjoyable, and I hope you got something out of it.
I think a lot of people got things out of it from what I'm seeing. So we have a couple of questions. So one question that I had, and this might just be my thinking of how you're moving forward with poetry. So poetry is a process that is very specific in its language, right? Like you're picking out these very specific points, like urgent gesture towards survival, like hits very hard in its specificity. And then you're talking about having these engaging, nuanced interactions with somebody by just using one word, love, right? And I'm wondering, like, how does that go together? How do you see love being big enough and nuanced enough to have all these different types of interactions given you're a poet?
That's such a great question. I think something I think a lot about is the spareness of language. Almost all the poems in my manuscript started off about twice as long as they ended up finally in the final version of the manuscript. There was a lot of paring away of the unnecessary, things that I had said more than once, things that I had said better in some other poem, things that just didn't belong in a particular poem. And so I think about the spareness of language and how a minimal amount of language can do a lot of work by just getting the brain going. There are some poems in my manuscript that are 2 or 3 lines long. And so communicating just in the word love to me was a gesture towards the spareness of language, and the ways that, yes, some, poems are longer than a single word for the most part, but trusting the ability of a few words put together to do something meaningful is one of the most important things I had to do when writing my manuscript. So in a very similar way, being able to communicate with just one word feels the same to me as being able to communicate in a poem that's only a third of as long as it could have been.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
like, I process things. It'll take.
Yeah.
I did have another question from someone who was curious about how you think your identity interplays with disability and the challenge of being an artist as an identified brown person. How is that seen in Filipino culture?
Yeah, I wrote a second manuscript outside of my thesis this past year. It's a play in verse about a house party with a bunch of Filipino American folks there. And what's this? Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah. How do you think about your identity and how it interplays with disability and the challenge of being an artist as a brown person, and how is that seen in Filipino culture?
Right. So I think it comes back to desire for me, and grappling with trying to feel desirable when having a marginalized identity. I sort of have understood my brownness and my disability in lens with each other as things that generally aren't desired in sort of this white, ableist, patriarchal society. And so the way I have sort of come to understand and embrace my brownness has been through the same process of writing poetry about disability. When I learned to understand that my madness is desirable despite the artifice surrounding it, it helps me understand that my brownness can also be desirable despite the sort of white artifice surrounding it. In terms of madness in Filipino culture, in a lot of cultures of color, mental illness, mental disability is a bit taboo, is a bit not spoken about. And so I think just writing, a play about a Filipino boy with schizoaffective disorder is just a way of talking about it. I think mental illness gets kept sort of hush hush in communities of color. And so writing a manuscript that embodies the life of someone with both of those identities and thinking of them as identities and not liabilities is just a way of creating more representation and is a way of showing that these sorts of people do exist in all their intersections.
Beautiful. And I hope this doesn't feel like a thesis, like questioning session.
No, I love this.
Okay. So I have another question, and I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it. It's just like all these different pieces have come in, and you're talking about epistemology and this creating something from nothing with words. And I'm thinking of specifically this disability hierarchy that kind of exists within the disabled world, specifically looking at folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, but also folks who have mental health diagnoses. How do you kind of see epistemology and disability justice, I think, kind of bridging those hierarchies to be less democratized, maybe? And how do you see maybe like the art that you were creating with Kevin kind of being an example of that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think, and that reminds me of something that came up in my thesis defense the other day, where I have a lot of poems about schizoaffective disorder, but I have a lot of poems that just talk about disability in general. Um, and I think one of the biggest things we can do is learn about different disabilities through other disabilities. So for me to learn through Kevin's experience of being deaf about my experience of being mad, right? Looking for analogs, and then that transitions into poetry with the use of metaphor, right? So sort of empowering metaphor to let us understand different disabilities through each other, I think can help break down those hierarchies by showing us that, even if in an embodied way, we're experiencing very different things, right? My madness is nowhere near deafness, right? But in a social way and in a lived way, our experiences are very similar in terms of marginalization, in terms of, having to rework the life around the disability to make it fit. Um, and so for me, I wanted to write poems that were both specific to my experience of madness, but also general to the experience of disability in order to use that liaison of metaphor in order to break down some of those barriers that make disabilities seem so different from each other on a practical level. Um, yeah, does that add up?
It does. And as you were talking, I was thinking of the concept of misfitting from both Rosemary Garland Thompson, but also Max Thornton, kind of talking about this misfitting of environment with body in
Mhm.
categorization of transness, but also disability, and just kind of like thinking of how that kind of plays into when we're changing the environment to kind of democratize this idea of disability versus disability.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is another question that says, do you plan on integrating other forms of communication into your poetry, such as visual, movement, or tactile? And I think that's kind of like looking at how you were communicating with Kevin and like the different ways that you were communicating. Can you see that
Mm,
kind of being brought in?
yeah, I mean, something I'm really trying to do in this Fulbright is keep a really open mind. I'm going to be in a new country that has a very different disabilities community. I'm going to be working with a bunch of different disabled artists. And so my MFA has sort of just been like sit down and write poems. And coming out of that, I have this basis of poetry, but I really just want to be open to the different artists I meet and the different disabilities that the people I meet all have. I've already connected with some non-speaking autistic poets, right? And that experience is very different. Um, and I sort of want to just like take things on the fly. And as much as I had to apply to the Fulbright with a specific plan, just show up ready to do really anything. Um, yeah, I'll be working at a place very similar to Imagine Art when I'm there. And so I just want to start new conversations, see new people's artwork, and think about how I can collaborate. I think that's probably what's going to expand myself most outside of just the written work into alternative media is collaboration with all these artists who I am going to be in contact with in Toronto. So I'm hoping I just meet, I mean, the goal is to just meet cool people who want to make art and celebrate disabled lives. It's on one hand, it's very academic. On the other hand, it's very fun.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds amazing. And just like watching you on this journey has just been so, it's been an honor to watch this happen. And I also never had any doubt that you would be in this place right now. So, it's hard to say that when it's like when you're going through it, but
Yeah.
we were all pretty sure about it.
Yeah. I
Um,
appreciate that.
do you have anything else that you would kind of like to add? I wanted to I'm going to do like the stuff I usually do in the beginning at the end, because I wanted to have more time in the beginning for you to do your thing. But I also wanted to acknowledge that this month is AAPI month, which is Asian American Pacific Islander month, and also Mental Health Awareness month, which is interestingly timely. It had nothing to do with us talking about this at all. It just happened to, fate happened. But is there anything else that you would like to add to this conversation or about your work, which is just beautiful? And I'm going to be revisiting the poem that you were talking about with being on the line and being on both sides of that line and being in that in-between space. I think is really, really powerful when I'm thinking about even just epistemology and disability theory.
Thank you. Yeah, I think all I want to say is just to underscore sort of my final points, which is there is something desirable about disability, no matter how big or small it makes a life. And I just want everyone to internalize that, because I think that's what I've spent like this whole MFA trying to do for myself. And I think I'm still only partway there. But I sort of just want to encourage everyone to start taking those steps towards understanding disability as an identity you can get excited about. There's so much, I often think about the disability community following in the steps of the LGBTQ community, and there's so much queer pride. And I want to build that up for the disabled community because we deserve it. We're fabulous, exciting, cool, wonderful people that need to be celebrated and actively desired. So that's all I want to close with is let's just love those disabilities.
I love that so much. And like creating this like something out of words. Like your words have created so much, I think is what I'm saying, Rob.
Thank you.
So I've been asked to also just like, I want to thank Rob for being here. Just so amazing about your journey and where you're going. And thank you for sharing all of this and just these beautiful sentiments. And I'm going to hopefully share this with more people as just, I think it's very rejuvenating, your work. It's like an exhalation, I think, in a lot of ways for folks. So I'm very excited to share it. I'd like to thank the Steve Hicks School of Social Work for allowing us to have these platforms, and the Graduate Education Fund and Texas Center for Disability Studies, and this, disability studies in general has just been amazing that I get to meet all of these amazing students. So please fill out the two question survey that Javier is going to be sending you. It's short and sweet and very easy, and it helps us a lot with funding, and so you can tell everybody how amazing these events are, and the people that we're able to speak with. And I think that is all I have. Again, I want to thank you so much, Rob, for sharing your experience and your insight and your art with us, and for being in this program and expanding it for us.
Thank you for having me. I remember finding out about this program and being like, yes, I have to do that. And it's just been the best addition to my MFA I could have dreamed of. I
did not tell him to say that, just for.
No, everyone do the CDS program.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording now.